next speaker is Sara Kolb, Linz Kunstuniversität. She's a research assistant.
Yes.
And so is known for linking Bergson and Duchamp in various publications, and searching for a topological justification of art and theory. And the title of her talk is "There is no progress, change is all we know. Notes on Duchamp's concept of plastic duration."
Well, thank you. Thanks a lot, Jacob, for inviting me, and I'm really happy to be here with all of you. And so I will start right away with my talk titled "There is no progress, change is all we know. Notes on Duchamp's concept of plastic duration," which will confront Duchamp's concept of the ready-made with that groundbreaking philosophy of evolution which the French philosopher Readymades developed since the 1880s, and since the late 1880s actually, and which crucially influenced the contemporary art world. So to begin with, I will introduce Bergson's concept of duration as opposed to the ready-made in terms of a central starting point for Duchamp's emancipation from historical avant-gardism. Then, in a second step, I will take a closer look at Duchamp's playful exploration of the ready-made, which dates back to 1915 and 1916. And finally, I will try to make some specifications regarding the principle of the ready-made against the background of Duchamp's reflections upon an idea of plastic duration. In 1958, in an interview with Lawrence S. Gold, Duchamp underlined the crucial role that Bergson played for his art with his primacy of change. Change and life are synonymous, he affirmed with reference to Bergson's philosophy. We must realize this and accept it. Change is what makes life interesting. There is no progress, change is all we know. Now, as Bergson has been generally recognized as one of the most important idea providers for the historical avant-garde movements, this nexus is anything but far-fetched. Actually, when Duchamp came in touch with Fauvism, Cubism and Futurism between 1905 and 1912, Bergsonism was just about to reach its peak and to become one of the major sources for all of these movements. Thus, it is out of question that Duchamp was conscious of Bergson's philosophy and its rich potentials. But while many of his artist friends related to Bergson's thought dogmatically, Duchamp soon decided to pursue another branch line and to break with any kind of dogmatism, be it artistic, scientific, or metaphysical. Still, and actually as a result of this decision, the deeply novel concept of art that he would develop from then on cannot be adequately understood without considering Bergson's dichotomic conceptions of intuition as opposed to the intellect, perception as opposed to action, precision as opposed to indifference, and in particular, duration as opposed to the ready-made. Against the background of Duchamp's radical turn away from conventional painting in 1912, going hand in hand with his critique of the proven Bergsonism of contemporary avant-garde movements, and being sealed with Duchamp's last painting, Bride, featuring an idea of radical becoming and transition, it can be taken for granted that with his multifaceted and playful oeuvre, Duchamp owed much more to Bergson than any of the ambitious exponents of avant-gardism, who under the banners of Fauvism, Cubism, or Futurism claimed to be in line with Bergson's philosophy of change, while actually adhering to illiberal manifestos and styles. It is important to note that Duchamp's critical attitude towards Bergsonism does not imply that he would himself turn his back on Bergson's philosophy itself. At the same time, it is clear that he wouldn't elevate it on a pedestal under a different name. On the contrary, in the following, I would like to argue that Duchamp's stratagem rather was to take philosophy of intuition at its word, in terms of a radical return to that paradoxical method of intuition which Bergson defined as the philosopher's most important tool in his Introduction to Metaphysics of 1903, by stating that an intuition, that is, an understanding of the ever-changing reality of life itself, might at best be facilitated by a choice of, this is a quote, images as dissimilar as possible. No image can replace the intuition of duration, Bergson states, but many diverse images, borrowed from very different orders of things, may, by the convergence of their action, direct consciousness to the precise point where there is an intuition to be seized. For the productivity of Duchamp's reserve towards Bergsonism speaks not least one of the central theses of Bergson's Creative Evolution of 1907, an epochal work which the French philosopher and writer Jean Guiton characterized as bold, confusing, poetical, and revolutionary, and where Bergson argues that the philosophy of evolution, which wants to really justify its name, must pursue, quote, reality in its generation and its growth, and will therefore be at best be built up by the collective and progressive effort of many thinkers, of many observers also, completing, correcting, and improving one another, quote end. Thus, Bergson would never claim to have the last word regarding such a philosophy of evolution. Instead, he points to the problem that the human intellect, the philosopher's instrument, is not at all as independent as one would expect, because it is, in its abstract advancing movement, it necessarily draws on static images and prefabricated ideas. The human intellect, Bergson makes clear, quote, feels at home among inanimate objects, more especially among solids, where our action finds its fulcrum. Finds its fulcrum, and our industry its tools, whereby it necessarily fails the full meaning of the evolutionary movement, Bergson states. In vain we force the living into this or that one of our molds. All the molds crack. They are too narrow, above all, too rigid for what we try to put into them. By denouncing avant-gardism for its overly intellectual conception of progress in art, Duchamp characteristically was of the same opinion as Bergson himself, who with regard to avant-garde art had basic reservations. In 1911, as he was questioned about the idea of multiple perspectives, which the Puteaux Cubists had related to his philosophy of duration, Bergson declared that he would challenge the recent phenomenon that theory precedes creation in regard to art. Quote, for the arts, I would prefer genius, and you, Bergson explained, while admitting that he hadn't even seen the paintings in question. And pointing to a picture of Rembrandt's philosopher reading behind him, he added, Rembrandt knew how to fixate the movement. The movement, what a miracle. One can suppose that the Puteaux Cubists, who should even try to win over Bergson to write a text for one of their catalogues shortly afterwards, took notice of this commentary, which was published on November 26, 1911. Hence, it is quite likely that Duchamp, who was an active member of the Puteaux group by then, not least reacted to Bergson's statement with several paintings on the issue of movement, which he completed in December 1911 and January 1912, Nude Descending a Staircase being number 2 being the most prominent among them. As is known, Duchamp's nude would provoke a veritable scandal within the Puteaux group due to its unconventional subject and literary title, illustrating a human figure in motion instead of the traditional pose. Now it is interesting that Duchamp's painting referred to one of Bergson's colleagues and intellectual opponents at the Collège de France, Etienne Jules Marais, who had developed his method of chronophotography in terms of an abstract analysis of movement. But just as Bergson would claim that with a series of static images one could never reflect real movement, Also, Duchamp signalized that his nude was definitely not to be understood as the representation of a real moving body, but in fact, quote, as a pure abstraction of movement, quote end. In Duchamp's eyes, in analogy to Marais' works, the painting nude does not generate an illusion of movement, but it does describe it, as Duchamp explains. Quote, after all, a painting is the diagram of an idea. Duchamp's nude therefore can be seen as a diagram of that kind of abstract movement, to the critique of which Bergson dedicated an entire chapter in Creative Evolution, titled The Cinematographic Mechanism of Thought and the Mechanistic Illusion. However, it cannot be ruled out that Duchamp would shrug off Bergson's artistic ideal as hidebound, while going one step further by using not only the scientific method of chronophotography, but also the winding stairs of Rembrandt's Philosopher in Meditation hanging in the Louvre as a basis for his own abstraction and deconstruction of movement. After all, with one of his early New York notes on the idea of a reciprocal ready-made, Duchamp would knock from his pedestal none other than the one who, according to Bergson, had been able to fixate movement. Thus, one could infer that Duchamp's provoking note, se servir d'un Rembrandt comme planche à repasser, can not only be understood in the common sense of using a Rembrandt as an ironing board, but also in the more subtle one of using a Rembrandt as a plate to leave something behind. Whereas Duchamp had dedicated his nude to the issue of movement in space, in the process of turning his back to avant-gardism, he also turned towards the issue of movement in time, in terms of that idea of becoming which Bergson had addressed with his concept of duration. Instead of promoting a mechanistic view, Duchamp's two paintings, The Passage from Virgin to Bride and Bride, sealing his exit from the contemporary art scene in summer 1912, rather describe something open, in process, and dynamic, as Jonathan Crary aptly remarks with regard to the passage, where he sees an active field of potentially infinite relationships. With the motive of the bride, Duchamp gives the first abstract expression of his idea using a virginal medium to marry the sensuous qualities of painting with an intellectual approach. In line with this idea, The Passage and Bride were to remain two Duchamp's last paintings in a traditional sense, whereas the subject of the bride would from now on lead him to an exploration of the most varied media, concepts and strategies. Actually, from 1912 on, Duchamp's work would be entirely dedicated to the subject of an organic bride accompanied by multiple forms of mechanistic bachelors or casting molds, with which Duchamp points to an interplay between the opposites of intuition and intellect, perception and action, the ever-changing reality of life itself, and the ready-made character of human interactions and conceptions. Opposites which Duchamp summarized in the formula painting of precision and beauty of indifference in his general notes for a hilarious picture, and which Bergson himself had defined as the central source of any kind of imagination and agency. Now it seems quite easy to relate Duchamp's primacy of change to works and concepts like the large glass, the green box, his female alter ego Elle c'est la vie, étant donné always understanding that it is the spectators who make the pictures, which are all intrinsically linked to an idea of constant transformation and transition. But actually, and paradoxically, as I will argue in the following, Duchamp also referred to Bergson's philosophy of duration with his concept of the ready-made. In the fall of 1915, shortly after arriving in his adopted home of New York, Duchamp began experimenting with his idea of producing prefabricated sculptures by depriving everyday objects of their conventional context and thus of their actual function. Obviously, the English term ready-made, not only pointing to contemporary consumer culture and its rich offers for women as a new class of customers, but also evoking connotations of a willing girl, a ready-made, as Thomas Zaunschirm has pointed out, inspired him to draw on some works which he had made earlier, namely a bicycle wheel and a bottle rack, which he had installed in his Paris studio in 1913 and 1914, while working on his notes for a large-scale multimedia work titled The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelor's Evening. Not least, the term ready-made may have attracted his attention, as the corresponding French term tout fait played a central role in Bergson's popular essay on laughter of 1900, which might have interested Duchamp, as he had always had a passion for humor, and which should actually find its way into his library. Repeatedly invoking the metaphor of the ready-made and ready-made clothes, especially, which could never fit the needs of an individual being, Bergson argues. The rigid, the ready-made, the mechanical, in contrast with the supple, the ever-changing and the living, absent-mindedness in contrast with attention, in a word, automatism in contrast with free activity, such are the defects that laughter singles out and would fain correct. And in his creative evolution, he would even go further. The history of philosophy shows us the impossibility of satisfactorily getting the real into the ready-made garments of our ready-made concepts. In order that our consciousness shall coincide with something of its principle, it must detach itself from the ready-made and attach itself to the being made. It needs that the faculty of seeing should be made one with the act of willing, a painful effort which we can make suddenly, doing violence to our nature, but cannot sustain for more than a few minutes. Now it is known that in 1915 and 1916, Duchamp bought a snow shovel, a steel dog grooming comb, and a limited number of other ordinary objects, so as to raise them into the status of works of art by placing them in his studio, inscribing them, or adding other details. But at the same time, Duchamp also started toying with the ready-made character of language itself, by freeing words and concepts of their actual function. Based on his rudimentary English skills, in October 1915, he wrote an experimental text titled "The," in which he formulated sentences that were intended to be grammatically correct, but which were not to have any meaning or to make any sense. That was only a kind of amusement, Duchamp stated half a century later, still pointing to the striking difficulties involved in this project. Quote, "The construction was very painful in a way," Duchamp explained, "because the minute I did think of a verb to add to the subject, I would very often see a meaning, and immediately, if I saw a meaning, I would cross the verb out and change it, until, working for quite a number of hours, the text finally read without any echo of the physical verb." Now, even if one had no wish to question Duchamp's intention, it is quite obvious that his project was foredoomed to fail. For even if on a superficial level the text in itself makes no sense, the individual words and word combinations inevitably evoke certain associations, and thus that kind of echo which Duchamp allegedly had tried to avoid. Moreover, while Duchamp's sentences definitely seem to be devoid of any meaning, many words actually appear to be chosen with care and to refer to a quite specific context. Replacing each asterisk with the definitive article as per advice, one can read, If you come into the linen, your time is thirsty, because the ink saw some wood intelligent enough to get giddiness from a sister. So, Duchamp not only brings up the medium of painting, linen, and his current joy in experimenting, your time is thirsty, but also writing per se, ink, which he associates with one of his intelligent sisters, his sisters in mind, Beatrice Wood, to whom it might owe its giddiness and whose name also reminds of the common typewriter brand Underwood. And reading on, we can see that Duchamp not only refers to his fatigue with linen, but also to his new conception of art, characterized by an integration of the most diverse media and techniques, including not only ready-mades, but also random experiments, the principle of boxes and their multiplication, as well as a certain dust breeding, which can be related to the wording, "The powder will take a chance." Furthermore, with the term stamp, Duchamp hints at another experimental text, which he also wrote in the fall of 1915, this time in French, and which he transferred onto 4 pre-stamped postcards on February 6, 1916, with an Underwood typewriter, by separating words and sentences or just cutting them off. Having pasted the cards together, he inscribed the work's title, Rendezvous of Sunday, February 6, 1916, at 1:45 in the afternoon, on the reverse side in black ink, and finally addressed it to his patrons, Louise and Walter Arnsberg. Duchamp's gesture of inscribing the exact moment of production onto the work opens an interesting perspective on the conceptual framework of his writing experiment, starting with the following lines. And this is my translation. One will be without, at the same time, less than before 5 elections, and also some acquaintance with 4 little broods. One must occupy this delight so as to decline all responsibility for it. After 12 photos, our hesitation in front of 20 fighters was understandable. Even the worst hanging demands good luck corners, without counting the prohibition as to the linens. How not to marry one's least oculist rather than stand their slow matches? As already in Rendezvous, Duchamp points at some ideas, images and feelings which are not far to seek before the background of the surrounding oeuvre, which actually has to do with a certain prohibition as to the linens, which he had imposed to himself in order to avoid the slow matches of his former colleagues in favor of some oculists appearing in the large glass. Then, instead of a porte-bouteille, there is talk about point porte-bonheur, that is, good luck corners, while the bottles, the bouteille and the corkscrew and the cage are mentioned elsewhere in the text. Duchamp points to the aspect of choice, the necessity to open up some big clocks and to limit the number of ready-mades. Avalis anticipating his miniature museum, a principle of high quantity, and so on and so forth. But the ready-made also plays a central role with regard to the mere production process. It is no coincidence that Duchamp used the pre-stamped postcards as well as the ready-made typeface of an Underwood to give his handwritten experiment its finishing touch and to shortly afterwards lift the cover of his typewriter to the status of a traveler's folding item. Furthermore, only 11 days after his literary rendezvous, on February 17 at 11 a.m., Duchamp bought a dog grooming camp, inscribed it with the date and time of its acquisition, and added the inscription "Trois ou quatre gouttes de hauteur n'ont rien à faire avec la sauvagerie," which means 3 or 4 drops of assertiveness have nothing to do with savagery. This object entitled "Kolb," which is addressed in the right lower corner of Rendezvous with the term peigne, and which actually figures as the first of exactly 5 ready-mades Duchamp chose in 1916 in accordance with the 5 elections, brings into play not only the delight which Duchamp felt in the process of making a ready-made, so as to decline all responsibility for it. With its actual function as a comfort dog and the term savagery, it also points to the brutes and can thus be related to the French expression bête comme un peintre, which Duchamp once used to explain why he admired the work of Raymond Roussel. I felt that as a painter, it was much better to be influenced by a writer than by another painter. This is the direction in which art should turn, to an intellectual expression, rather than to an animal expression. I am sick of the expression bête comme un peintre, stupid as a painter. While Duchamp inscribed his ready-mades so as to carry the mind of the spectator towards other regions more verbal, as he explained in 1961, with regard to Kolb, he also pointed out that there have been amusing situations with the ready-mades, like, quote, deciding about a certain hour, a certain day, to choose a ready-made, unquote, in terms of a, quote, rendezvous with fate, quote, end. This is also what we learn from a note from his green box, which must date back to the time when Duchamp had just arrived in New York, as it refers to a kind of rendezvous, while at the same time documenting Duchamp's use of the English term ready-made. In his specifications for ready-mades, Duchamp reflects upon planning for a moment to come to inscribe a ready-made, which can later be looked for with all kinds of delays. The important thing then is just this matter of timing, this snapshot effect, like a speech delivered on no matter what occasion, but at a certain hour. It is a kind of rendezvous, Duchamp adds, and naturally one had to inscribe the date, hour, minute on the ready-made as information, while not least pointing to the serial characteristic of the ready-made. By linking the principle of the ready-made with potential delays, a special kind of timing, a photographic snapshot, a kind of rendezvous, Duchamp defines the act of choice by analogy to an open-ended encounter. As already implied in his phrase, one must occupy this delight so as to decline all responsibility for it. He obviously takes pleasure in subverting every form of personal taste or interest, leaving the appearance of his sculptures entirely to the potential of the moment. This can also be related to a note from the white box, actually titled in the infinitive, and thus implying an open-ended process, where Duchamp proposes to try to discuss plastic duration, which he explained to the editor, Cleve Gray, by stating, "With this I mean time and space." Consequently, whereas Bergson proposed to recur, quote, to many diverse images borrowed from very different orders of things, unquote, in order to facilitate an intuition of duration on a theoretical level, with his ready-mades and writing experiments, Duchamp aimed to borrow objects and concepts from daily life so as to make way for ever-changing forms of action and perception, and to plunge in other dimensions in terms of a tactile exploration of time and space. As another note from the white box reveals. Significantly, none other than that kind of experience is being addressed by Bergson in his essay on laughter, as he stresses that he doesn't, quote, intend imprisoning the comic within a definition, unquote, because he sees it as something living, which can go along with, quote, the strangest metamorphosis, unquote. Bergson points to something more flexible than an abstract definition, that is, quote, a practical, intimate acquaintance, unquote, which could at best be described by some concrete examples, as he states. Now, presuming that laughter requires indifference on the part of the beholder, as it has no greater foe than emotion or affection, Bergson gives the example of a man running on the street who suddenly stumbles and falls, whereupon some passers-by laugh. But according to Bergson, what makes them laugh is not the sight of the man in the position of having fallen, but rather that his change of position had been involuntary. Quote, "The laughable element consists of a certain mechanical inelasticity, just where one would expect to find the wide-awake adaptability and the living pliableness of a human being. Thus, as already mentioned, it is the ready-made, the mechanical, as opposed to the supple, the ever-changing and the living, absent-mindedness in contrast with attention, which laughter singles out and would fain correct." From this perspective, Duchamp's ready-mades can be understood in terms of such an underlining and correcting of stereotypic behaviors and concepts, which can be seen as a stumbling block for everything living. Thus, the coat rack, which Duchamp nailed to the floor of his studio in 1917, entitled Trap, is just exemplary for his concept of the ready-made. Actually, it unfolds its humor only through the eventuality of its being unnoticed, causing in the inattentive spectator both the possibility of a physical fall and an involuntary change of position in the figurative sense. Duchamp applies the rigid and the mechanical of the mass product to create a margin for the unexpected and the remarkable. With his trap, he gives us the chance to laugh about his artwork as well as about our own imperfection. Thank you for your attention.